The inspection log read clean. That was the first thing Senior Compliance Auditor Vethkaz noticed when she pulled the file 3 months after the fact. Not the bodies, not the structural damage to Containment Ring 7, not even the classified footage that had since been redacted by 4 separate oversight committees. The first thing she noticed was that the log read *clean*. Every human weapon cataloged, every edge instrument, every propellant device, every electromagnetic emitter, every object with a hardness rating above what the hegemony's legal threshold defined as capable of penetrating Class II biological tissue. All of it logged, tagged, stored in Vault Sigma 9 beneath the station's 3rd sublevel. The log read clean because, by every legal and technical definition the hegemony possessed, it was clean. That was the problem. The human had arrived on processing station Arath 7 11 weeks before the incident, transported via standard refugee relocation protocol from the Kepler exclusion zone following the hegemony's absorption of what humans called the Cygnus Corridor. His name, according to the intake form, was Marcus Yale. Occupation listed, Logistics Coordinator *. No military designation. No combat classification. Medical history flagged only a healed fracture in the left forearm, and what the intake physician, a Drevari named Sewell, had described in her notes as an unusual density of scar tissue across the palmar surfaces, origin unclear, patient non-communicative about source. Sewell had not flagged it. Scars, after all, were not weapons. Vethkaz would return to that note later, much later, when returning to it would no longer bring her any comfort. Marcus Yale had been assigned to Residential Block 14, alongside 47 other humans and 11 members of species classified as Tier 3 cooperative species that had surrendered treaty rights and now existed under hegemony administrative care. The block was monitored. The corridors were monitored. The meal distribution hall, the sanitation facilities, the communal rest areas, all monitored. The monitors had recorded everything. Nobody had understood what they were seeing. The first mystery surfaced on day 4. A surveillance analyst named Drethva, young, recently promoted, assigned to the overnight monitoring rotation, had submitted an anomaly report that his supervisor at the time had marked low priority, behavioral curiosity. Drethva had noticed that Marcus Yale, every single night between the 3rd and 4th sleep cycle, rose from his designated rest position and spent between 40 and 90 minutes sitting motionless in the corner of the block's communal area. Not packing, not speaking to others, not accessing the food dispensary or the sanitation unit. Just sitting. In the dark. Drethva's anomaly report asked a question that his supervisor had found almost charmingly naive. Is the human performing a function we do not have a category for? The supervisor had written back, humans exhibit irregular sleep architectures, marked as biological variants and close. Drethva had closed the report. He had also, because he was the kind of analyst who could not let a question die easily, added a personal notation that never made it into the official file. It does not look like sleep dysfunction. It looks like preparation. What he didn't know then, what none of them knew, was that Marcus Yale was not alone in this behavior. Across residential blocks 9, 11, 14, and 22, 17 other humans were doing the same thing. Different hours, different corners, same stillness. Nobody had connected the pattern, because nobody had thought to look across blocks. That was the second mystery, though it would not be identified as a mystery for another 6 weeks. The third arrived quietly, the way the worst things always do. On day 19, a hegemony supply clerk named Ossifel was processing the weekly inventory for Block 14's maintenance allocation, the small permitted store of repair materials that residential blocks were entitled to under standard care protocol. Fiber bonding strips, atmospheric sealant, replacement filtration mesh, standard items, none of which appeared anywhere on the hegemony's 7-tier weapons classification index. Asifel noted, without concern, that the humans in Block 14 had requested 3 times the standard volume of fiber bonding strip. The request was within the block's quarterly allocation ceiling, so it was approved without escalation. Asifel noted it, filed it, moved on. Later, much later, Vethkaz would sit with that inventory record for a very long time. She would read it, then read the confiscation log, then read it again. She would do this 6 times before she understood what she was looking at, and then she would sit very still, in a way that her colleagues would afterward say reminded them, uncomfortably, of the surveillance footage of Marcus Yale in the dark. Week 3 was when the hegemony's compliance division first began paying structured attention to the humans on Arath 7, not because of anything the humans had done. Because of a political event entirely outside the station, the Cygnus Corridor Resistance had made a statement, a recorded transmission, poorly translated, broadcast on civilian frequencies before hegemony signals intelligence could suppress it. The statement had said something that the translation algorithms rendered after 4 revision passes, as, "The ones you moved first are the ones you should have watched most carefully." The compliance division's response had been immediate and, in retrospect, precisely wrong. Director Malav Heath, the station's senior administrative authority, had ordered a full secondary confiscation sweep of all human residential blocks. Every item that had not been present on the original intake manifest was to be located and removed. Every maintenance material was to be physically inspected and recategorized against the weapons index. The sweep teams had been thorough. They were trained for this. They moved through Block 14 in full compliance gear, 2 hegemony security officers per sweep team, with a technical assessor carrying a portable classification scanner that could identify material threat profiles down to molecular composition. They found nothing. Nothing beyond permitted materials, the sweep report stated. Human residential population compliant. No weapons-capable materials detected. Marcus Yale had stood against the wall during the sweep with his hands visible at his sides, watching the officers move through the block. One of the security officers, a breath-class enforcer named Von Sekit, had noted in his personal log that the human had not displayed the elevated biological stress markers typical of subjects undergoing inspection. No elevated respiratory rate. No avoidance behavior. No furtive repositioning. Subject appeared, Von Sekit had written, patient. He had meant it as a neutral observation. He would later understand it was the single most important word in his entire career's worth of documentation, and it had meant something he was not yet equipped to interpret. "You're not worried," said the Drevari physician Sewell on day 26, during Marcus Yale's mandatory monthly health evaluation. She had not intended it as an accusation. She was a physician, not an interrogator, and her professional instinct when she observed an anomalous biological reading was to ask about it directly. Marcus Yale looked at the diagnostic panel she had angled toward him, then back at her. He had a quality of stillness in his face that she had initially classified as emotional suppression, common in recently displaced populations, well documented, clinically unremarkable. "Should I be?" he said. "Your cortisol analog is not elevated," Sewell said. "We conducted a full compliance sweep of your block 3 days ago. In comparable populations, we see a measurable stress response that persists for 7 to 10 days. You show no such response." He said. "That is unusual." "Okay," he said. She waited for elaboration. None came. She made a note in her file. Subject does not exhibit anticipatory anxiety consistent with displacement stress. Possible emotional dysregulation, possible cultural difference in stress expression, possible suppression mechanism. Recommend follow-up. She did not write the thing she was actually thinking because she was a physician and not given to impressionistic clinical notation, But the thought was this: he is waiting for something, and whatever it is, he already knows it's coming. The station's analysts had, by this point, formed a working theory about the humans of Arath 7. The theory was comfortable, internally consistent, and catastrophically wrong. The theory was this: the humans who had been relocated from the Cygnus corridor were a civilian logistics population, non-combatant, low threat. The resistance transmission referencing, the ones you moved first, was psychological warfare, an attempt to make hegemony authorities waste resources surveilling non-threatening populations while actual resistance cells operated elsewhere. The humans on Arath 7 were, in the clinical language of the threat assessment document, a distraction asset, passively deployed. This theory explained the strange calm. It explained the lack of contraband. It explained the unusual overnight stillness that Drethva had flagged in his anomaly report. The humans knew they were being watched. They were performing compliance, deliberately and precisely, to tie up hegemony surveillance resources. It was a logical conclusion. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking the hegemony's analysts were trained to recognize and account for. It was completely, irreversibly wrong, and not in the direction anyone expected. Day 31. Vethkaz would later call this the hinge point, the moment where every subsequent event became inevitable, though no one could see the shape of the hinge until it had already swung. A maintenance worker, not human, a Drevari station laborer named Paseth, submitted a repair request for a section of atmospheric conduit in the corridor adjacent to Block 14. Standard maintenance. He accessed the corridor crawlspace with his toolkit and found, lodged in the secondary conduit junction 17 meters from Block 14's ventilation intake, a small object roughly the length of his forearm. It appeared to be a coil of fiber bonding strip, wound tightly around a section of replacement filtration mesh. This was, under any classification system the hegemony operated, not a weapon. The classification scanner confirmed, no threat-capable materials detected. Paseth moved it aside, completed his repair, and mentioned it to his shift supervisor as a minor tidiness issue. His shift supervisor mentioned it to the block's administrative coordinator. The administrative coordinator, who was more careful than most, forwarded it to Drethva, now reassigned to a broader monitoring role, simply because it seemed like the kind of small detail that Drethva, with his peculiar instinct for anomalies, might find interesting. Drethva stared at the notation for a long time. Then he pulled the inventory records, the triple volume of fiber bonding strip, the filtration mesh requests. He pulled them for Block 14. Then he pulled them for Blocks 9, 11, and 22. He sat with these numbers for most of his shift. Then he sent a message to Vethkaz that read only, "I think the sweep teams found exactly what the humans needed them to find." Vethkaz was mid-seniority, which meant she was experienced enough to understand what Drethva was implying and senior enough to understand how badly it would be received. She requested an appointment with Director Malav Heath and was given 15 minutes. "They are placing objects in the infrastructure," she said. "Permitted objects, objects that individually register as maintenance materials. We don't know what they're assembling." Malav Heath had the particular stillness of an administrator who has heard many alarming things from subordinates and learned to evaluate their credibility before permitting them to disrupt his schedule. The classification scanner confirmed no threat-capable materials, he said. "The classification scanner evaluates individual objects," Vethkaz said, "against a defined index. We built that index based on our understanding of weapons. I am suggesting we may not fully understand what humans are capable of constructing from materials that do not appear on our index." Silence, then. "That is a very large claim." "Yes," she said, "I know. What specifically are you proposing they're building?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said carefully, I don't know, that's why I'm here. Malafheath authorized an expanded monitoring protocol. More cameras. More analyst hours. He did not authorize a second physical sweep, because the first sweep had been clean, and a second sweep would require documentation that could invite oversight inquiry from the hegemony's central administration, which would reflect poorly on Arath 7's compliance record. He would regret this for the rest of his administrative career, which ended 6 weeks later. What the expanded monitoring showed was, initially, nothing alarming. The humans ate. They slept irregularly, yes, in the way that Drethva had noted, but nothing had changed about the pattern. They spoke to each other in the communal areas. Some of them laughed. The laughter in particular had always unnerved certain members of the monitoring staff in a way they struggled to articulate. There was something in the frequency of it, the apparent ease of it, that felt discontinuous with the circumstances. These were displaced people under administrative detention in a foreign station. The laughter seemed statistically improbable. Analyst Drethva flagged it, because he flagged everything now. His supervisor told him to stop. On day 44, Marcus Yale asked Physician Sewell, during his second monthly evaluation, whether the station's atmospheric recyclers were functioning within tolerance. Sewell blinked. That's not a medical question. No, he agreed. I've been having some respiratory irritation. Thought it might be filtration related. Sewell checked his respiratory readings. They were normal. She noted this in the file. She also noted that she could think of no reason for a logistics coordinator in a monitored residential block to have any particular awareness of the station's atmospheric recycling infrastructure. She mentioned this to Drethva, because by now she had learned that Drethva was the analyst who collected the pieces of things other people set aside. Drethva read her note. He looked at the conduit diagram for the section of station containing blocks 9, 11, 14, and 22. He saw how those 4 blocks connected. Specifically, he saw what they all shared. He filed an emergency escalation. The escalation took 32 hours to route through the administrative system and reach Veth Kaz. By the time she read it, she was already on her way to Block 14 because Von Sekit had opened an emergency channel. The hinge had swung. Here is what the hegemony's analysts had understood and what they had not. They had understood that the humans were doing something. They had understood it was coordinated. They had understood that it involved materials the classification systems did not flag as dangerous. They had not understood the time scale. They had not understood that 47 humans had been executing a plan, not a simple plan, not a plan contingent on access to weapons-capable materials, but a plan built entirely from what was permitted, what was available, what could be moved through maintenance crawlspaces in small increments over 6 weeks without triggering any alarm, and doing so while being watched, precisely because being watched was a condition they had already incorporated. They had not understood something fundamental about the way Marcus Yale and the others thought about their situation. The hegemony's analysts had modeled human behavior on a framework borrowed from every other species they had ever administered, that a subject population, stripped of weapons, stripped of communications, stripped of freedom of movement would wait, would endure, would, perhaps, slowly and unsuccessfully plan resistance that ultimately failed for want of physical capability. The framework was not wrong about most species. It was wrong about humans in a specific, catastrophic way that Veth Kaz would spend the next 3 years of her career trying to articulate in language that the hegemony's administrative apparatus could actually process. The closest she ever got was this: humans do not require weapons to be dangerous. They require asterisk time and a problem to solve. You can take the weapons. You cannot take the problem solving. And if you give humans time, even confined time, even monitored time, even time spent sitting in the dark in the corner of a residential block appearing to do nothing, you have given them the one thing they actually need. Every other species the hegemony had ever administered had, at some point, accepted a ceiling, a limit of what was possible given the constraints of their situation. They might resist within that ceiling. They might endure and organize within it. But the ceiling was real to them. It structured their thinking. Humans, as best Vethkaz could later describe it, did not appear to perceive the ceiling. Von Seket's emergency channel opened at 3:40 station time, which was, not coincidentally, the precise window between the third and fourth sleep cycle when 17 humans across 4 residential blocks had been observed sitting in the dark. The ventilation output in Block 14 has changed, Von Seket said. The control room analysts could hear it in his voice, not panic, not yet, but the precursor to panic, the specific register of a person who is looking at something and cannot yet name what they are looking at. I'm showing an atmospheric pressure differential between Block 14 and the adjacent service corridor. The corridor is at lower pressure. The block should be at lower pressure given the recycling configuration, not higher. Something is pushing air from the block outward. Vethkaz reached the control room at a run. Show me. The display showed an atmospheric diagram. Block 14, glowing slightly warmer than it should have been. The service corridor adjacent to it, cooler. Between them in the ventilation conduit, a pressure differential that was small, well within what might theoretically be attributed to equipment fluctuation but sustained. Stable, not random. How long, she said. I've been monitoring since Drethva's escalation, 22 hours. 22 hours, she said, and before that. Unknown. The system would not have flagged it as anomalous unless someone was specifically looking. Vethkaz stared at the display for a long moment. She thought about 47 humans. She thought about fiber bonding strip, coiled around filtration mesh in a maintenance crawlspace. She thought about a man who had asked his physician about atmospheric recyclers. Get me Malav Heath, she said. Get me the sweep team, get me everything. And then, because she was Vethkaz and she could not stop the particular movement of her own mind any more than Drethva could stop his, she said, very quietly to no one in particular, we were looking at the wrong question. The question was never what they were building. The question was what they were doing with it. The sweep team entered Block 14 at 4:18. Marcus Yale was awake, so were several others. They were sitting in the communal area, not in their rest spaces, in a cluster that the security officers would later describe as relaxed, not tense, not defensive, not the posture of people who had been caught. We need to conduct an inspection, Von Seket said. Of course, Marcus Yale said. He stood slowly with the particular economy of movement that Von Seket had noted before. Where would you like us? This was the moment, Von Seket would later say, when he understood not what was happening, but that something was happening that the sweep would not stop. Because the human's voice had none of the specific quality that voices have when a plan is being interrupted. It had instead the quality that voices have when a plan is already complete. The sweep team found nothing. The fiber bonding strips in the maintenance crawlspace were gone. The filtration mesh, all of it was back in the storage allocation, nearly stacked, within permitted quantities. Every surface of Block 14 registered clean on the classification scanner. I don't understand, said one of the sweep officers, and Von Seket almost wanted to explain to him that not understanding was, at this moment, the only appropriate response. They pulled back to the corridor. Von Seket opened his channel to Vethkaz. Nothing, he said. On the atmospheric monitor in the control room, the pressure differential between Block 14 and the service corridor had already normalized. Whatever they had built, whatever they had assembled over 6 weeks from permitted materials in a monitored residential block, it had already done what it was meant to do. The evidence was already gone. The materials were already replaced, meticulously, within allocation. The only question was what it had ** done. The answer came in 3 pieces, and each piece was worse than the last. The first piece arrived when a station systems analyst, running a routine diagnostic, noticed that the communications encryption layer for the station's administrative network had been accessed from an internal node at 3:11, 30 minutes before Von Seckett's emergency channel, 47 minutes before the sweep team entered Block 14. The access had not been detected in real time because it had used a valid internal address and had lasted only 11 seconds. The analyst found it only because he was specifically looking for the kind of anomaly that left a trace too small to trigger automatic flagging. 11 seconds, not enough time to transmit data through conventional means. Unless the data was already compressed, already staged, already waiting. Unless 11 seconds was all you needed if you had spent 6 weeks preparing. The second piece arrived when Veth Kaz, rereading Drethva's escalation documentation, reached his diagram of the atmospheric conduit connections between blocks 9, 11, 14, and 22. She had looked at this diagram before. She had registered what he was highlighting, the shared infrastructure. This time, she looked at it differently. She thought about pressure differentials. She thought about fiber bonding strip wound around filtration mesh. She thought about 17 people sitting very still in the dark at the same time every night. She thought about acoustic transmission, about how a sustained pressure differential in a conduit could, if the materials in the conduit were arranged precisely, carry signal. Not electromagnetic signal, nothing that would register on the station's communication sensors. Vibrational signal, physical pressure variation, regular and patterned, moving through shared infrastructure between 4 residential blocks. She called Drethva. They were talking to each other, she said. Silence on the line. For 6 weeks, she said, while we were watching them do nothing, they were coordinating, through the ventilation system, using pressure differentials they created and controlled with materials we classified as maintenance supplies. The overnight stillness, Drethva said, and she could hear him arriving at the same place she had just arrived. They weren't sitting in the dark. They were listening. The third piece was the worst. Veth Kaz pulled the communications access log again. 11 seconds. She looked at the timestamp, 3:11. Then she pulled the atmospheric monitor records for all 4 blocks between 200 and 3:11. The pressure variations had been continuous since 200. 70 minutes of what she now understood to be transmission. Then, at 3:11, 11 seconds of network access from a valid internal address. She looked up which systems the access had touched. Personnel registry, specifically transfer and relocation scheduling. She looked at what information had been available in the personnel registry as of 3:11. She looked at the date. And then she understood completely and finally what had been planned, what had been executed, and what had already happened. She sat very still. The hegemony had, as part of its standard administrative protocol for Tier 3 cooperative populations, been processing transfer documentation for the human residential population of Arath 7. 12 humans, specifically the 12 who had been categorized in the intake assessment as having potential technical or logistics value, were scheduled for relocation to hegemony administrative facilities. Not punishment, reallocation. The hegemony had infrastructure to maintain, and it utilized available labor efficiently. The transfer was scheduled for 600, standard protocol. The 12 humans would be escorted to transit processing. This was not classified information, technically. It existed in the personnel registry. It was accessible to any internal administrative address with registry-level clearance. It had been in the registry for 11 days. Marcus Yale was on the transfer list. He had not been told. Hegemony policy did not require advance notification of Tier 3 cooperative transfers, because experience had shown that advance notification increased behavioral disruption during the transfer process. He had not been told. He had been sitting in the dark every night for 6 weeks, listening. And somehow, through 11 seconds of network access that Vethkaz still could not fully reconstruct the mechanism of, through some combination of tools and technique assembled from filtration mesh and fiber bonding strip, and 6 weeks of patiently solving a problem in the dark, he had known. He had known for 11 days. He had said nothing. He had showed no stress markers. He had asked his physician once about atmospheric recyclers. And then he had sat quietly in the communal area and waited for the sweep team and said, "Of course, where would you like us?" in a voice that had the quality of someone whose plan was already complete. Vethkaz stood up. She had one thought, moving very fast through her mind, and she needed to get to transit processing before 600. She ran. She arrived at transit processing at 5:47. The escort team was already assembled. The 12 humans were already there, seated in the processing bay, paperwork in hand, cooperative and calm. Marcus Yale was not among them. Von Sekit was standing at the edge of the processing bay, looking at the assembled group, with the expression of a person who has recently discovered that the floor is slightly less solid than previously believed. "Where is he?" Vethkaz said. "Yale submitted a medical deferral at 4:31, Von Sekit said. "Signed off by Sewell. Respiratory complaint. He's in medical." Vethkaz stared at him. "The deferral is valid," Von Sekit said. "Physician authorized. Under Hegemony Administrative Code, a valid medical deferral postpones transfer for a minimum review period of." "I know what the code says." She was already moving. He knew he was on the transfer list. He had 11 days. He planned for this. Von Sekit fell into step beside her. "He can't defer indefinitely. It buys time," Vethkaz said. "That's all it needs to do." She stopped walking. She stood very still in the middle of the processing bay corridor, and she did something she had not done in her professional career. She stopped thinking about what Marcus Yale had done and started thinking about what Marcus Yale was doing. Not past tense, present. The 11-second network access had touched the personnel registry. She had been focused on what information he had *extracted. She had not asked what information, if any, he had *changed. She turned and ran back to the control room. The registry modification was small. A single field change in the administrative categorization of 11 humans, not the ones being transferred, the ones remaining. A categorization field that affected which administrative review tier their ongoing case files were assigned to. It was not a dramatic change. It did not free anyone. It did not smuggle anyone out of the station or destroy any infrastructure or threaten any life. What it did was route their case files to a different oversight body. Specifically, to a Hegemony administrative review panel that was, according to the Hegemony's own internal legal structure, required by treaty to notify the Cygnus Corridor, Resistance's recognized legal representative of any administrative action affecting the case files under its review. The treaty had been negotiated years prior. It was obscure. It was rarely invoked. It existed because some bureaucrat in the original treaty process had pushed for it, and some other bureaucrat on the Hegemony side had judged it harmless enough to permit. Marcus Yale had found it. He had found it and read it and understood it, and then he had spent 6 weeks building a communications network out of ventilation pressure and filtration mesh, so that he could coordinate with people in 3 other residential blocks. And then he had used 11 seconds of network access to move 11 case files into a review tier that activated a treaty notification mechanism. 11 case files. 11 people who were not on the transfer list, who were not going anywhere, who were simply, by the quiet operation of the Hegemony's own legal structure, now known to exist by name and location to someone outside the station. It was not a rescue. It was a signal. An undeniable, legally protected, treaty-mandated signal delivered through the hegemony's own administrative apparatus, using only materials and mechanisms that the hegemony had voluntarily made available. Veth Kaz read the case file modification. She read the treaty clause. She read the notification trigger. Then she sat down, because her legs had done something unusual. He wasn't building a weapon, Drethva said from across the room, very quietly. No, she said. He was building an asterisk proof of location. Yes. She thought about the laughter, the statistically improbable laughter in the communal areas, the laughter that had unnerved the monitoring staff. She understood it now. Not defiance, not irrationality, just people who were in the middle of solving a problem, who had found a solution, and who were carrying the particular lightness of people who know something that hasn't happened yet. She thought about a man who sat in the dark and listened for 6 weeks and showed no stress markers, not because he was suppressed, not because he was performing, but because he genuinely did not feel cornered. Because he was not, in any meaningful sense, in a corner. They had taken every weapon. They had logged them, tagged them, stored them in Vault Sigma 9. They had swept the block twice and found nothing. They had watched him every hour of every day and seen nothing dangerous. And he had built something out of nothing that the classification system had no category for. Because the classification system was built on the assumption that the dangerous thing was always the asterisk object asterisk. She thought about what Sewell had written in the medical file. The scar tissue across the palmar surfaces. Origin unclear, patient non-communicative about source. She pulled the file now and stared at that notation. She thought about what kind of work left that pattern of scars. Repeated, sustained, manual work. The kind that built up over years. She thought about what Marcus Yale's occupation had been, listed on the intake form. Logistics coordinator. She thought about what a logistics coordinator did. They moved things. They found paths between points where no obvious path existed. They solved the problem of how to get something from where it was to where it needed to be, across any obstacle, within any constraint. He hadn't been a fighter. He had never been a fighter. That was not what the resistance had sent. The resistance had looked at a processing station with full weapons confiscation protocols and comprehensive surveillance, and had decided that what was needed inside it was not a combatant. It was someone who could look at a problem and not see a ceiling. Director Malav Heath received the treaty notification timestamp at 6:04. He was in his office. He read it twice. He called Veth Kaz. "Explain this to me," he said. A case file modification in the personnel registry triggered a treaty notification requirement, she said. The notification has already been transmitted through the hegemony's own administrative relay. We cannot retract it without formally acknowledging we are in violation of the treaty, which would require a hearing before. "I understand the legal structure," he said, and his voice was very controlled in the way that voices become controlled when the speaker is preventing them from being something else entirely. "Explain to me how a human in a residential block with no communications access, no weapons, no classified materials, and no contact with the outside." "He had contact," she said. "He had time." Silence. "We were measuring the wrong things," she said. "We built the classification index around physical capability, material threat. We asked, does this object meet the threshold for harm? We never asked," she stopped, started again. "We never asked what they could build from what we allowed them to keep." A longer silence. "What do we do now?" Malav Heath said, and she could hear in his voice that he was genuinely asking. Not rhetorical, not strategic, actually asking. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think we need to fundamentally reconsider our framework for what constitutes a threat." She heard him exhale. Then, "The notification has already reached them. The Resistance knows we have these 11 people. They know exactly where they are. Yes. So this isn't over. No, she said. I think this is specifically the beginning. Marcus Yale was released from medical observation at 1100, his respiratory complaint having resolved satisfactorily according to Sewell's notes. He returned to Block 14. He ate in the communal area. He spoke to people. Someone said something and he laughed, the laughter that unnerved the monitoring staff, and then he sat quietly for a while. At 1340, Vethkaz walked into Block 14. She had authorization. She had not told Malav Heath she was coming. She wasn't sure she had a clear professional reason for coming. She came because she needed to look at him, now that she understood what she was looking at. He looked up when she entered. He had a stillness about him that she understood now was not calm exactly, but something more specific. The quality of attention in a person who is processing a great deal of information very efficiently and is not expending energy on things that don't require it. She sat down across from him. No officers, which was unusual. She had come alone, which was more unusual. "You know we found the modification," she said. "I assumed you would," he said. "But not in time to stop the notification." "No." She looked at him for a moment. "You weren't trying to escape." "No." "You weren't trying to sabotage the station." "No." She leaned forward slightly. "You came here to send a message. That's the only thing you were ever trying to do, from the moment you arrived." He met her gaze in a way that most species under hegemony administrative detention would not do, not defiant, not aggressive, simply direct, level. "We don't need to escape," he said. "We need to be found. There's a difference." "By the Resistance." "By anyone who's looking," he said. "The Resistance, a treaty oversight body, a journalist with a sympathetic frequency, a bureaucrat who reads case files carefully." He paused. "Someone who ran through a transit processing facility at 5:47 because she'd figured out something wasn't right." Vethkaz sat with that for a moment. "You're not going to get what you want," she said. "The notification reaches the Resistance. They know you're here. What does that change?" "Everything," he said. "Or nothing. But now you have to assume it changes everything. You have to act like it changes everything. You have to reallocate resources, reconsider protocols, bring in oversight, renegotiate your operational posture." He looked at her with the steady patience of someone who has sat in the dark for a very long time solving a problem. "That's the point. Not what we do, what you have to do." She stared at him. "We cost you more to hold than to release," he said quietly. "That's the equation. We've been building toward that equation since we arrived. You took our weapons, that's fine. You can have them." He spread his hands, the scarred palms facing upward. "We didn't need them." Vethkaz looked at his hands. She thought about Sewell's notation, origin unclear. "What do you do?" she asked. "Actually, not the intake form." He considered the question, with what seemed like genuine attention. "I find paths," he said. She stood. She stood and she looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about everything she would have to write in her report, and about the framework she had told Malav Heath they needed to reconsider, and about the fact that she did not yet know how to write the things she needed to write because she did not yet have language for it. The hegemony's legal structure would process the notification. Reviews would be triggered. Things would move because she had been right about the equation holding them cost more now. The math had changed, not through force, not through any material capability, through a man who found paths and had 6 weeks and permission to breathe. She walked to the block entrance. She stopped. "The overnight sessions," she said, without turning around. "The stillness in the dark. You were receiving transmissions from the other blocks." "Yes." "For 6 weeks." "Yes." She turned. "And sending, what were you sending them?" Marcus Yale looked at her, and something crossed his face that was the first expression she had seen from him that was not steady. It was brief. It might have been, she thought, something like the weight of 6 weeks of sitting in the dark. We were telling each other, he said, that we were still here. She left. The report Vethkaz eventually submitted was 47 pages. It was read by 3 administrative levels before it reached the Central Hegemony Oversight Committee, and at each level someone had tried to modify the core finding, which was this. The hegemony's weapons confiscation protocols were operating on a definition of weapon so narrow as to be functionally irrelevant when applied to humans. The committee's response was to expand the classification index, to add new materials to the tier system, to improve monitoring protocols and surveillance coverage and cross-block communication interdiction. Vethkaz read the response and thought about the equation, about what costs more. She thought about a logistics coordinator who had sat in the dark for 6 weeks with nothing but permitted materials and an unsolved problem, and had found a path. She thought about what would happen the next time, the time after that. She thought about all the ways the hegemony could expand and refine its classification index. She thought about a man who had looked at a ceiling and not seen it. The committee's expanded index was 1,200 items longer than the previous version. It was not long enough. It would never be long enough, and somewhere in some residential block, in some monitoring file flagged low priority by an overworked analyst, in some small detail that looked like nothing, someone was already sitting very still in the dark, in the window between the 3rd and 4th sleep cycle, listening for the pressure variations that meant someone on the other side of a wall was still there, was still here, was still working on the problem. The hegemony had taken every weapon it could name. It had not taken the only thing that had ever mattered, the absolute, irrational, exhausting, relentless refusal to accept that the ceiling was real. They had taken the weapons, they had left the humans. They would spend the next